Chapter 6. The Terminus of the Quest. Surrounding granite hillocks radiate the heat. The toddy palms abound the area. Their juice makes the people tipsy, or rather, innocent and plain without masks. In spite of the inadequate supply of water, the region is known for its quality rice and chilies. The rocky hillocks provide wonderful views of the emerald green paddy fields, of small ponds of water reflecting the clear blue skies, serving as the drinking water reserves for the cattle and people. The region has endless wilderness echoing the clear, soft sounds of nature. This is Warangal, in the Telangana region of Andhra Pradesh. Educationally, Warangal is very rich with the professional colleges in engineering, medicine, and also all other faculties of learning. Any institution, or for that matter, any group, can be used to observe and study the human nature. In the Regional Engineering College, located at Kazipet, a suburb of Warangal, students from all over the country build their careers. It used to be, and one believes it still is, represented by the whole country with all types and cross sections of the people. Ajit Kumar Reddy, doing his civil engineering, was from Hyderabad. His father was a landlord and he had inherited some of the landlordship through his love for luxury and relaxation. Nothing pleased him more than sleep. With the slightest gap in the theory or practical periods, he would rush to his room to have 40 winks. It was during the gap between the semesters when the students either go home or stay back and have fun that he thought of a brilliant idea. He told his friends that he would like to assess his capacity for sleep. The friends agreed to wake him up and supply food from the mess from time to time. First day he got up to have food when they woke him up. Second day he skipped his dinner. Third day he skipped his lunch and dinner. And on the fifth day the friends forced him to break his long sleep. Puran Singh Chowdhury from Hyderabad, Haryana, was from an agricultural family with a special fondness for food and health. No one could challenge him in the bench press exercises and push-ups. He could do 500 push-ups at a time. His friends wanted to know his capacity for eating chapatis. To the surprise and horror of the mess cooks, he ate 96 chapatis till the mess warden intervened to stop him at the desperate appeals from the cooks. There were others who were attached to food qualitatively. They prided themselves of knowing the speciality in each eating joint in not only Warangal but Hyderabad and Secunderabad. The college had another group which influenced and governed the fashion of the region with their trendy and sometimes innovative clothes. Quite a few students had fascination for sports, yet other for music and arts. Many students were obsessed by their love for films. Strange as it may seem, but some of them engaged themselves in quarrels with fellow students. When they went to town, they would invariably come back satisfied after having scraps with the local people. Most of them were interested only in the purpose for which they were there, studies and scoring high grades. A microscopy group which was interested in all the extracurricular activities as well as study had come under the influence of a teacher who was steadily forcing them to ask some fundamental questions about life in general and themselves in particular. They occupied themselves in asking questions and discovering answers that changed with their increased understanding. If someone were to ask all these students involved in the apparently myriad of activities individually as to why they engaged in a particular inactivity or activity, the answer would be invariably that they did not know exactly. But yes, they enjoyed doing it as the particular action gave them satisfaction or happiness. Avoidance of pain has been one of the primary responses in our long history of evolution. Whatever is painful or dangerous to the body is avoided instinctively. The creatures have survived by their ability or become extinct by their inability to keep themselves away from danger and pain. Reflex action is an unconscious aversion for the danger and pain. Similarly, whatever is agreeable to survival and whatever gratifies their senses evokes an attraction which in turn brings about a feeling of pleasure in the creatures. In human beings, the pleasure principle depends on myriad of reasons such as likes and dislikes, attitude, milieu, state of mind, and much more. If we observe even casually, we find that all our actions are aimed at the avoidance of misery and seeking happiness, from seeking the basic necessities to the enlightenment. Swami Harshananda begins his preface in his Sanskrit work Karma Yoga Sutra Shatakam. Atyantika dukkha nivrittihi Shashvata parama sukha praptischa sarva praninam ishtatamam lakshamiti prasidhyeva. The most desirable aim of all creatures is known to everyone as the elimination of the innermost misery and a search for the supreme and permanent happiness. A creature is miserable when overpowered by hunger or thirst, and satiating the need removes the misery. A man is unhappy due to the paucity of material objects and is unhappy because he is not able to control others. Acquisition of objects or having control over others brings him happiness. Someone is miserable due to the awareness of his ignorance, and gaining knowledge brings him happiness. Similarly, the discovery that one is bound by the limitations of the body, senses, mind, intellect, and ego evokes profound agony, and one tries to overcome the limitations through enlightenment, which helps one transcend all misery. The Upanishadic seeker is aware that he is bound by his limitations and wants to overcome them. His questions to the enlightened master to whom he approaches reflect his priorities and nature. His questions on existence or on wisdom or on happiness only show his point of approach. The Upanishads declare that all misery is eliminated, all doubts dissolved, and death overcome when one realizes the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality, hinted at by the name of Brahman, which means infinite, transcends all attributes. For the sole purpose of realizing it, the sages observed that it has three approaches. First one, they called it Sat, which means absolute existence, because they discovered that the process of birth, life, and death happen in it. Taittiriya Upanishad observes, Yato va imani bhutani jayante yena jatani jivanti yat prayantyabhisamvishanti tad vijitnyasasva tad brahmeti. That from which all these beings are born, that by which they live having been born, that towards which they move and into which they merge, that is Brahman. The simile of the ocean hints at this point. The waves and the froth, which are born in the ocean, live in the ocean, and into the ocean they merge. The ocean remains amidst all the hectic activity. Wisdom or knowing, as different from knowledge, which is only the information is the second approach, which they called it as Chit. Chit is pure awareness, the very principle of wisdom. This aspect they described. Satyam Jnanamanantam Brahma. Brahman is truth, wisdom, and infinite. Third is through bliss, which is causeless as against happiness, which invariably depends on some cause. They called this approach as Ananda, or bliss absolute, which is the fountainhead of bliss. Anando Brahmeti Vyajanat. He realized bliss as Brahman. Anandam Brahmano Vidwan na bibheti kadachaneti. One who has known the bliss that is Brahman is not subjected to fear. Raso vaisaha rasagum hevayam labdhanandi bhavati. He is verily the source of joy, for one becomes joyous by coming in contact with the source of joy. The seeker, depending on his natural aptitude, gets the genuine doubt how to realize the immortal principle, or how to achieve the pure awareness, or how to transcend all misery by identifying with the principle of bliss. To these questions, the rishis of the Upanishad appear to give one standard reply: silence the mind, as the mind in its non-thinking state, in its pre-thinking state, in its silent state, is the basis of all this creation and is the immortal principle, and that state is the very principle of bliss. And this non-thinking state of mind is our Swarupa, or the true and fundamental nature. This state has been called as the Paramapadam, or the supreme state, or the state of all possibilities. We find scattered in the Upanishads the singular and startling conclusion of no mind, or beyond mind, or the silent mind in ever so many ways that each statement tries to give the seeker a better insight. Kathopanishad declares, Yada panchavatishtante jnanani manasa saha buddhischana vicheshtate tamahu paramam gatim. When the five senses of knowledge come to rest together with the mind, and even the intellect does not function, that state they call the supreme. The state of all possibilities, from where spring the life, wisdom and bliss, transcends the senses, mind as well as the intellect. Kenopanishad clarifies this further. Na tatra chakshur gacchati, na vag gacchati, no manaha, na vidmo, na vijanimo, yathai tadanushishят, anyadeva tadviditat, atho aviditadathi, iti shushruma purvesham, yenastadvyacha chakshire. I cannot approach it, neither can speech nor mind. We do not therefore know it, nor do we know how to teach it. It is different from what is known, and it is beyond what is unknown. Thus we have heard from our predecessors who instructed us about it. The senses have been called as the windows. By very nature, the windows are limited and cannot possibly help us perceive the infinite. The mind seeks for the meaning of existence in various objects and events of the external world. Even the mind, as such, is limited. Just as a cup cannot hold the ocean, or a room cannot contain the sky, the mind, including the intellect and the senses, cannot possibly comprehend the infinite reality. And unless one transcends the limitation, one cannot go to one's root. It is as if a drop or wave cannot know its true nature of being the ocean as long as it is identified with its drop or wave nature. Chandogyopanishad puts it beautifully. Yo vai bhuma tat sukham nalpo sukhamasti bhumaiva sukham bhumatveva vijidnyasitavyam yatra nanyat pashyati nanyat shrunoti nanyat vijanati sa bhuma yo vai bhuma tadamrutam. Decidedly in the infinite lies happiness and never in the finite. Because the infinite alone is happiness, the infinite alone should be sought after. Where nothing is seen, nothing is heard, and nothing is known, that is the infinite. Infinite verily is the immortal principle. A sense perception is effected only when the mind is behind the particular sense that is active. Thousands of stimuli from the sense objects like smell, sight, touch, taste, and sound hit our senses during the day and night. Only a few of these get registered and recognized, while others are summarily rejected by the mind. The facet of the mind responsible for this function has been called in Vedanta as Manas. Even if the senses were capable of perceiving the infinite, which they are decidedly not, they are not much of help as the mind is selective in its choice. This tendency to choose makes the mind limited and conditioned, as the choice is governed by the attractions and aversions, which are in turn dominated by the pleasure and pain principle. In his Yoga Darshanam, sage Patanjali defines raga, the attraction, as sukhanushayi ragaha. The craving for pleasure is raga, and aversion or dvesha as dukkhanushayi dvesha. In fact, the attraction and aversion limit all mental activities, including analysis, decision making, and remembering. The infinite, by its very nature, cannot be comprehended by the finite. That is why most of the verses in the Upanishad negate the mind. Mental activity is sustained by the desires. Every thought is a potential desire. Upanishads suggest the elimination of the desire to conquer the mind. Yada sarve pramuchyante kamaye asya hridishritaha atha martyo mruto bhavati atra brahma samashnute. When all the desires residing in the mind get eliminated, then the mortal becomes immortal and attains Brahman in this very body. The desires have their source or main source in the objects of senses. Shandilyopanishad says, Jneya vastu parityagad vilayam yati manasam manaso vilayam yati kaivalyam avashishyate. From the renunciation of objects of senses, the tendency to go out merges into the mind. When the mind merges into silence, what remains is the state of kaivalya. The objects need not necessarily be sense enjoyments. They may even be the concepts of enjoyment in heaven or supra-physical planes in the life after death. There are two beautiful verses appearing in different Upanishads which end with the same line. Yan manos trijagas srishti sthiti vyasana karmakrit tan mano vilayam yati tad vishno paramam padam. Dhyana Bindu Upanishad. The mind habitually involves in the acts of creation and sustenance of the three worlds. When that mind merges into silence, then that supreme state is of Vishnu. Yoga Shikhopanishad says, Dhvanerantargatam jyotihi jyotishontargatah manaha tanmano vilayam yati tadvishnoh paramam padam. From the primal vibration emanates the light of knowership and experiencership. Out of this light manifests mind. When the mind merges into silence, then that is the supreme state of Vishnu. Vaikuntha, the plane of God Vishnu, is the cherished goal of a devotee. The above verses give the clarification about the state. After giving the various characteristics of the mind, the verses say that the silence of the mind is the real state of Vishnu and not the one usually conceived of as that of having the ocean of milk with the doors bedecked with gems and so on. The verses negate all external joys, sources of joys, and hint that the joy is within and is the state of no mind. Mind is the instrument through which we gather information of the external world, understand it after analyzing the information, remember it for a later use, and also take decisions based on such understanding. The Upanishads negate the mind and all its activity. There is one Upanishad, the briefest, about which it has been said, Ekam mandukyam evalam mumukshanam vimuktaye. One mandukya alone is sufficient to bring liberation to the seekers. It says, Nantav prajnam na bahif prajnam no bhayatah prajnam na prajnanaghanam na prajnam na prajnam prapanchopashamam shantam shivamadvaitam chaturtham manyante sa atma sa vidnyeyaha. Not the cognition of the inside, not outside, not the cognition of both inside and outside, not the pure cognition, not non-cognition, cannot be seen, cannot be transacted with, cannot be possessed, does not have any qualities, cannot be thought of, cannot be located. It is one having the essence of everything. It is the resting place for the universe. It is peace itself, auspicious, non-dual. It is the self and should be experienced. The Upanishadic conclusion appears singular and startling, as apparently it is against the common experience of what is usually understood as creativity, knowledge, and happiness. Cosmologists are of the opinion that creativity, and that too the creation of this existence, is a cosmic event involving the natural forces and some other coincidences. Religions believe in a monotheistic God who is behind this creation. They even explain that the three letters of the word God depict the three functions of generation, organization, and destruction. Our common experience tells us that our knowledge involves active participation of the senses, mind, and intellect. But for the observation through the senses, explanations and logical presentations of the intellect, the science and technology would not be where they are today. Even our literature, commerce, and other endeavors in learning are based on the thought and its offspring and speech. As far as our happiness is concerned, it appears as if it is totally dependent on the active involvement of the senses and mind. The contact of the senses with their objects bring the happiness. However, the approach of the Upanishads, as we know, is to deal with the within of all experience and learning. Consequently, the creation, learning, and happiness dealt in the Upanishad are from a totally different dimension, though the conclusion is as logical as it is practical and useful in life in all its aspects. During the dialogues of the Upanishads, the rishis must have faced some obvious doubts raised by the common experience and understanding of the seekers. The seekers must have had discussions or even friendly arguments with the rishis, for one of the golden axioms of the quest of the phenomenal knowledge, not to mention the quest of the highest truth, has been fearlessness in questioning the conclusions of the proposer of the theory or the master who has known the truth. 20th century has confirmed beyond any doubt that all knowledge acquired by the scientists about the nature and its forces is only probable, because every theory is being questioned and put on the anvil of reason and experimentation and explanation. The solid and sure world of Descartes and Newton has been said to be limited. Quantum theory, the theory of relativity, unified field theory, and the contemporary M theory have become the most probable explanations till these two are questioned and perhaps discarded to be replaced. The material sciences had to negotiate through the dark ages when the scientists like Copernicus, Galileo, Bruno were persecuted or even executed. But thousands of years back, this kind of open-mindedness and spirit of inquiry was encouraged, nay, even respected by the rishis, who exclaimed in all appreciation, Adiprashnan pruchasi, brahmishtosi iti tasmat teham bravimi. You are asking supernormal questions, since you are preeminently a seeker of Brahman. Hence I speak to you. The Upanishadic seekers had the capacity for antarmukhata or internalizing the mind. Necessarily, their doubts must have been at a much deeper level. Traditionally, the teacher gives the conclusion to the seeker. Having heard the truth from the Guru, it is the seeker's responsibility to withdraw into his own mind and examine. But most of us are not even aware that the mind can also have an inner direction and dimension. How can we possibly derive benefit from the Upanishads, knowing that they are a great source of help to human beings at all the stages of their development and growth? It is only a question of making the arguments of the Upanishads more contemporary to suit our times. A discussion may help in understanding the Upanishadic thought. At the outset, we doubt the very argument of the condition of the mind governs our happiness and otherwise. Our normal experience tells us otherwise. An external event or situation governs our happiness. When our senses come in contact with their objects, there is pleasure. If the contact brings about unhappiness or pain, there is unhappiness. Someone appreciates or depreciates our work or person, we become happy or otherwise. It appears apparently that the external circumstances bring about happy or unhappy feelings in the mind and not the condition of the mind. After the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus in 1492, when the people of European origin migrated to the new promised land, they began their life with the conviction that the external situation and possession of more material objects helped in gaining more happiness. This conviction is behind America's tremendous material prosperity and has helped to develop the work culture. We find that the best of the brains and talent from all over the world rushes to the United States of America and achieve job and work satisfaction. As far as the scientific and technological progress is concerned, America and the other developed countries lead the whole world to set examples. All the technological progress has indeed reduced the physical inconveniences of humanity, found cures for the ailments that were once considered fatal, and is increasing the comfort level and leisure. However, the questions with all the comfort, is man comfortable? Or with the acquisition of sense objects, is he really happy? Do not really have any positive answers for these questions. On the contrary, life appears to be getting more and more complicated and shallow. The growing disturbance, irritation, intolerance, and violence have even put a question mark on the so called progress. Thinking persons everywhere have started asking, has man really grown out of his barbaric past, or has he just worn a mask of sophistication? The present situation makes it evident that the happiness and the misery are inner states of mind. Even a casual observation shows us that while a person gets disturbed to the point of misery to an external situation, another is least disturbed. It may be argued that the tolerance limit of the individuals differ, and that misery is not the real test, but happiness is. It is agreeable that a particular object or situation triggers the happiness. However, the happiness really does not depend on it. For instance, music is a sense object that gives us happiness, but the music does not evoke any happiness in us all the time. When one is not in the mood of listening, it never gives us happiness. On the contrary, it may spoil the mood further. The Upanishads tell us that happiness is a consequence of the state of the silent mind, which may have been triggered off by an external situation. They don't deny it, but they say that it's a consequence, it's not the real cause. Even as the above arguments convince us intellectually that the happiness is a state of mind, a nagging doubt continues. Our common experience tells us that the silent mind is difficult, if not impossible. All the time, the mind is active and is never silent. Although we experience happiness, we are aware of the sensation of the object creates, and the thought and feeling which brings us joy. The mind, thus, is involved with the senses or situations all along. It appears at the superficial level that silent mind is not a common experience. Moreover, the sense enjoyments give us happiness. A compliment, a word of praise gives us joy. A good deed or an act of kindness gives us happiness. During such moments, we are involved and participating actively. The Upanishadic tradition offers a few hints and suggestions indicating the general approach and shows some landmarks while giving the ultimate truths. But the burden of conducting the inquiry lies squarely on the seeker. He or she has to necessarily withdraw into the privacy of his mind or her mind and observe, question, contemplate, and come to one's own conclusions which match with those of the Upanishads. This process may take a long time, but there is no shortcut to this process. Moreover, the shortcut can really be detrimental to the person because he will be only borrowing the truths from the scriptures. Only those truths which have come out of our own experience can help us transform the life. If one is lucky, however, and has the gracious guidance of an experienced seeker, then it becomes easier. It becomes a guided tour of the spirit. The discussion has to be restructured to suit the contemporary time and experience. In a discussion, the seeker has come to a point where he finds the Upanishadic conclusion contrary to his own simple, well-learnt views. the teacher understands the unacceptability and the anxiety of the seeker. He does not get disturbed, but smiles indulgently, for he too must have had a similar setback when he was first introduced to those truths. He coaxes the student to reevaluate in greater depth. It is possible that we, in our hurry, says the teacher, overlook the deeper truths and be satisfied with superficial ones. Many times, we may ignore certain significant experiences just because they are infrequent. There are moments, even in our day-to-day life, which point towards the state of no mind. Take the life of a busy executive. Every day he faces new targets, challenges, pressures, anxieties, and tensions. Especially in the corporate sector, he is uncertain of even his own job. No doubt, a successful executive is one who has the capacity to face and meet the increasing problems, and there may be many who find the job dull without those very challenges and accompanying tensions. But every one of us, without exception, has a soft spot of our choice where one likes to withdraw to relieve the tensions. Let us imagine that on one particular day, our executive, whom we have considered as an example, is particularly tense. His soft spot is nature. He goes for a stroll in a park or a place abounding in nature. The beauty or the quietude of the place eases all his tensions, to this extent that even the thoughts and priorities of his work go to the background. He is rid of all cares. This happens to every one of us sometime or the other. It may be while sipping a cup of coffee, listening to music, gardening, or even walking. The seeker, who is necessarily sincere, observes that in his hurry he did fail to take note of such moments when the mind is mellow, if not totally silenced. Such state is definitely pleasant and it is sought after. But it is just a glimpse or only a flash. Whereas most of our time we are in thinking state. Since it is a short-lived state, it does not deserve much attention. At this objection, the Upanishad then reminds us that again in our hurry to object, we have not examined our states. We have considered only the waking state, overlooking the deep sleep state. This state is characterized by no mind, as there is no thinking, no jnatra, the cognizer, jnaya, the cognized, and jnana, the cognition, and one is in the undivided causal state. As far as the time parameter is concerned, it constitutes 1/3 of our life and certainly not short-lived. A man on the average spends 6 to 8 hours in sleep. Children and invalids sleep much longer. Moreover, no one can deny that it is a pleasant and a comforting stage. Every one of us is drawn to this state of silence. It is the state of rejuvenation after a busy, tiresome, or even anxious state of activity. We do not wish to exchange this state with anything else. As a consequence of competitive and fast life, insomnia is one of the grave problems faced by mankind. It is said that the sale of tranquilizing drugs outdoes all other drugs put together. This only goes to prove that the thinking state is burdensome and we desperately seek the comforts of sleep. Thinking tires the man and sleep refreshes him. Commenting on this state, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad grows lyrical and spreads into a lengthy passage under divine inspiration. In it lies the highest wisdom of a very general and fundamental nature which can benefit and comfort mankind as long as human race survives on this planet. It says, Atra mata amata bhavati, pita apita bhavati, loka alokaha bhavati, deva adevaha, atra steno asteno bhavati, bhrunaha abhrunaha, chandalo achandalaha, shramano ashramanaha, tapaso atapasah, ananvagatam punyena, ananvagatam papena, tirno hi tada sarvan shokan hridayasya bhavati. In this state, a father is no father, a mother is no mother, worlds no worlds, the gods no gods, the Vedas no Vedas. In this state, a thief is no thief, a killer of an embryo is no killer, a Chandala no Chandala, a Pulaksa, one born to a low caste woman and a warrior, is no Pulaska, a monk no monk, a hermit no hermit, is untouched by good work and untouched by the evil work, for he is then beyond all the woes in his heart. Upanishad makes a wonderful observation that comes under the common experience of everyone. In the deep sleep state, the father has to shed all his burdens and responsibilities of his fatherhood, looking after the family, arranging its financial needs, social needs. These problems are not bothering at all. The mother too has kept aside her concerns and cares that go with the motherhood. It says that the world and knowledge too have totally dissolved for the one who is asleep. Not only the noble qualities like austerity, renunciation and humility found in gods, monks and hermits, but also the evil tendencies and the accompanying tensions characterizing the thieves and killers too have gone into the background. The pride or the diffidence of the noble or ignoble birth too has been washed off in that causal and undifferentiated state. With this explanation, the seeker is quite satisfied and convinced that even normal people do experience the thought-free state daily. But he is still not satisfied, as the deep sleep state is a negative state characterized by unconsciousness and dullness, whereas the happiness experienced during the sense pleasures is a positive state. Further, the example of the tense executive is also negative in the sense that his tensions and anxieties are released. It is like a person's feeling of relief after unburdening the load on his head. A release of tension could only be a neutral or a negative state and cannot be reckoned as happiness. Thus, absence of misery cannot be happiness. Paradoxically, most of our so-called happiness is either relief from our tensions or absence of misery. A desire to acquire something or even to become something or to feed the senses with their objects enters our consciousness. As and when the intensity increases, it creates a kind of restlessness in us. We put whatever effort to the best of our capacity and finally fulfill it. At the time of fulfillment, we are unburdened and released of the desire. Unfortunately, soon after, and many times during the time we enjoy this non-tension period, we invite another desire and the story begins once again. The Upanishads point out this flaw and suggest that we look at the state of mind during the moments of happiness. As pointed out earlier, the seeker of truth through the Upanishad is necessarily capable of introspection and has comparatively a calmer mind. The Upanishads take the example of sex pleasure, which happens to be the strongest of the sense pleasures sought by man. Compared to this pleasure, all others retreat into insignificance. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad notes, Priyaya striya samparishvakta nabahyam kinchanam veda nantaram. A man fully embraced by his beloved wife is not aware of anything at all, either external or internal. For any experience, three things are mandatory. The triplet of experience. The experienced and the experience has been called in Vedanta as the Triputi or the three. Without any one of these, the experience as such is not possible. The Upanishad makes a startling observation. The enjoyer of the sense pleasure is in an empty state of mind when there is no awareness of the enjoyership, the object of enjoyment, and the enjoyment. Thus, by taking the most intense of the sense pleasures, it suggests that during all the sense pleasure or states of mental happiness, the mind is incapacitated to think and is pushed into the state of non-mind or no mind. But this state is so short-lived that we attribute the happiness to the object. This is the basis of materialistic view of life. Deep down, moreover, the senses have their capacity for indulgence as they lose their power to indulge. Kathopanishad points out, Shvobhava martasya yadantakaitat sarvendriyanam jarayanti tejah api sarvam jivitamalpameva tavaiva vahas tava nritya gite. All the pleasures are transient. O death, they wear out the vigor of all the sense organs of mortal man. Moreover, all life is only little. Let your chariots, dance and song remain with you only. Instead of indulgence, the Upanishads suggest that one should try to prolong the emptiness of the mind. The happiness increases as the emptiness of the mind increases. As the silence increases, one realizes that the silence is one's true nature, which they called the Atman or Purusha. This Purusha, incidentally, is the source of all creativity, all wisdom, and all existence. Mundaka Upanishad observes, Purusho hyajaha aprano hya amanaha Shubhro hyaksharatvat paraha etasmad jayate prano manas sarvendriyani cha kham vayujyotirapa prithvi vishwasya dharini. Purusha is birthless. He is without prana, the vital force, and without mind. He is pure and superior to Maya. From him originate prana as well as the mind. All the senses, space, air, fire, water and earth, that supports everything. When the scientists who have had insights into some of the mysteries of nature are asked how they discovered the truth, many, if not most of them, confide and confess that they do not know, and that it was invariably when they were in a totally relaxed mood. Perhaps when they were either enjoying nature or music or even while strolling, but it was usually when they were least occupied with the problem. Archimedes discovering the buoyant force while in the bathing tub is known to most of us. Even our normal experience of remembering some fact is significant. When we tend to forget a name or a fact sometimes, it so happens that no matter how hard we try to recall the fact, we are unable to do so. But when we are doing something else and relaxed, there is a sudden burst of memory, as it were. Sri Ramakrishna used to give the analogy. For a person weighing grain from these heaps in a grain silo, any amount of grain is available. Similarly, for one who has merged with his self, wisdom is available. He does not have to store or hoard any knowledge, as he has mastered the art of knowing, that is, tuning himself to the source of wisdom. India specialized in the art of control and silencing the mind. Even those persons devoting their life to secular sciences like medicine, dramatics, music, art, literature, and warfare were called as rishis or sages. And they began their treatises with an invocation to help the seeker of a particular branch of knowledge to attain mukti, or the freedom as life's fulfillment. In this sense, there was no division between spiritual and secular. It was due to the deep experience and conviction obtained therefrom that any and every act emanates from the state of silent mind or no mind, which is our Swarupa or innate and fundamental nature. Swami Vivekananda used to say, freedom is the one goal of nature, sentient or insentient, and struggling towards that goal. That freedom which the saint seeks is very different from that which a robber seeks. The freedom loved by the saint leads him to the enjoyment of infinite, unspeakable bliss, while that on which the robber has set his heart only forges other bonds for his soul. We say that it is freedom. We say that it is freedom that we seek, and that freedom is God. It is the same happiness as in everything else, but when man seeks it in something which is finite, he gets only a spark of it. The thief, when he steals, gets the same happiness as the man who finds it in God, but the thief gets only a spark with a mass of misery. The real happiness is God, love is God, freedom is God, and everything that is bondage is not God. Every creature, consciously or unconsciously, seeks the ultimate reality which has been called as Sat Chit Ananda, or existence, wisdom, bliss absolute. When it is sought unconsciously or instinctively as a matter of course, life becomes limited with the accompanying pairs of opposites like pleasure-pain, happiness-misery, and life-death. Such life tends to become purposeless as it apparently culminates with death of the body. But when it becomes conscious and as a matter of choice, every moment becomes meaningful and adventurous. The beauty is, every human being is fated to shake off the unconsciousness and awaken himself, to become a pilgrim towards truth or an adventure of consciousness, for arriving at the terminus of the quest or the Brahman of the Upanishads.